An old photograph dated September 1898, on the back, 4 children standing solemnly in front of a Victorian house, seems like a snapshot from the past. But some photographs never tell a single story. They leave behind blank spaces, unnecessary details, or empty eyes that make you wonder. What's behind that silent smile? Would you like to take a closer look with me? On October 12, 2024, art conservator Sarah Mitchell carefully unpacked a shipment of antiques recently delivered to the Salem Museum of Local History in Massachusetts. Among the Blackwood family's belongings, one photo stopped her. A beautiful period document, she whispered, holding a magnifying glass to the faces of the black and white figures. The image was remarkably intact, sharp focus, clean composition as if time had forgotten it for a moment. But as Sarah looked closer, the initial sense of relief was replaced by an unsettling unease. The 4 children, ages 8 to 12 perhaps, posed solemnly, the boys in black suits, the girls in long dresses. Their lips were stern like a 19th century portrait. But their eyes weren't like the eyes of ordinary children in old photographs. Not fear, but a void, an absence, as if something essential had been taken from them. Have you ever seen that look in an old photograph? That feeling that childhood had been hollowed out sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She decided to digitize the photo using a high-resolution scanner. As the image scrolled through the scanner, Sarah heard a small voice in her head, "Look closer." As the file appeared on the computer screen, she began to zoom in, piece by piece. And then she saw it, a shadowy figure hidden in a window, behind the house wall, as if silently observing the scene. "That's strange," she whispered, adjusting the contrast to make it clearer. It didn't look like a family member stepping out to pose. It was crouched, like someone standing behind a curtain, watching with a hidden gaze. Someone was watching or watching. A few days later, on October 14, 2024, Sarah spent the weekend researching the Blackwood family history. The genealogical records showed the family had been prominent in Salem in the 1890s, but there were cold gaps between the pages. The house in the photo belonged to Cornelius Blackwood, a wealthy textile mill owner who had made his fortune during the late 19th century boom. According to government records, Cornelius and his wife Margaret adopted 4 children between 1896 and 1898. An unusual occurrence for the time. The names of the 4 children were listed on the adoption papers: Thomas 12, Elizabeth 10, Samuel 9, and Mary 8. That was quick 4 children in just 2 years. Sarah murmured as she looked at the documents. 4 adoptions in 2 years? That was unusual for 1898. What do you think, a wealthy family adopting so many children in such a short time out of sheer kindness? Sarah contacted Dr. Helen Morrison, a historian specializing in New England social history. Helen had spent a lot of time researching 19th century Massachusetts adoption laws and understood the legal framework of the time. After reading through the documents and looking at the scans, Helen's voice came through the phone with a distinct concern. "Sarah, take a good look at the girls' dresses." And Sarah did, zooming in on every stitch, every fold of fabric. Helen was right. The material, the style didn't look like the clothes of the wealthy. The dresses looked like the uniforms of some institutional clothing, rather than family fashion. A detail that was both obvious and provocative. If the clothes were uniforms, where had the 4 children belonged? and if they had been taken into the Blackwood household as quickly and strangely as the documents suggested, who had given them away, and for what reason shadows lurking in window frames, empty eyes in photos files, with blank spaces, all like pieces of an untold story. When Sarah zoomed in further, the cold light of her monitor revealed every stitch in the children's clothing. The girls' dresses were identical, the same cut, the same fabric, the same tiny row of buttons running down the front. Even the boys' suits were eerily uniform, not a single thread out of place. Everything looked too perfect, too deliberate. What kind of place would use clothing like this? Sarah murmured to herself. On the other end of the line, Helen fell silent for a long moment before answering softly, almost reluctantly. Orphanages, asylums, or... She hesitated. Institutions for disturbed children. In the late 19th century, that's where they sent anyone they considered broken. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. On her laptop screen, the faces of the 4 children seemed to look back at her with hollow eyes. Digging through the county archives, she stumbled upon a record that made her heart race. Cornelius Blackwood, the man who had supposedly adopted the 4 children in the photo, was listed as the principal benefactor of something called the Salem Institution for Disturbed Children. It had operated from 1885 to 1902, until its abrupt closure for what official documents vaguely described as severe administrative irregularities. The rest of the details had been sealed by court order. On October 16, 2024, Sarah arrived at the Essex County Archives. The archivist James Crawford, a frail old man who had worked there for decades, greeted her with a mix of curiosity and unease. The Blackwood Institution, he repeated slowly. It's been years since anyone's asked about that place. The documents are in the sealed basement, but... He paused. Be careful with what you find. There were reasons they buried it. The basement air was thick with dust. Boxes marked 1885-1902 sat in uneven stacks, untouched for more than a century. Sarah lifted one of the lids, her hands trembling. Inside were bundles of yellowed medical records written in the delicate slanted handwriting of another age. The Salem Institution for Disturbed Children had been officially created to treat mental and behavioral disorders in minors. But the internal reports told a far darker story. A medical file dated 1897 described experimental therapies performed on children between the ages of 6 and 14, prolonged isolation in containment cells, controlled starvation to modify behavioral impulses, psychological conditioning through sensory deprivation. Sarah whispered under her breath, "My God." Then came an internal memorandum dated August 1898. Experiment 247. Subjects show signs of complete docility and loss of resistance after 6 months of treatment. Proceed immediately with photographic documentation. Attached to the file was a list of names, and they were chillingly familiar. Thomas Whitmore, Elizabeth Hayes, Samuel Porter, Mary Campbell. The original surnames of the 4 children in the photograph. Another note dated September 15, 1898 read, "Subjects have reached the desired state of total compliance and elimination of individual personality. Proceed with documentation before the final phase." Sarah's stomach turned. The photograph she had found wasn't a family portrait at all. It was scientific evidence documentation of an experiment that had stripped away the children's identities. At the very bottom of the box, she found one final document. It bore the signature of Dr. Moray Blackwood Cornelius's brother. Experiment completed successfully according to established parameters. Proceed immediately with the final disposition of subjects to prevent future complications. Dated September 20th, 1898. 2 days later, on October 18th, 2024, Sarah was still working through records and digital archives. Dr. Moray Blackwood's name appeared again and again in medical registries. He had been a psychiatrist, a controversial one, educated in Europe, where he studied advanced techniques of psychological conditioning. In Harvard Medical School's archive, Sarah found his 1885 doctoral thesis titled Advanced Methods of Psychological Conditioning for Permanent Modification of Aberrant Childhood Behavior. She closed the document slowly, her pulse echoing in the silence. On her screen, the 4 children stared back, blank, obedient, emptied of all that once made them human. And she couldn't help but wonder. The thesis was chilling in its precision. It described methods to reform children considered problematic, not through kindness or care, but through isolation, sensory deprivation, and systematic psychological manipulation. Even for the 19th century, such techniques were unspeakably cruel. Dr. Robert Hayes, a medical historian at Harvard, explained it best when Sarah reached out to him. Blackwood believed he could reset a child's personality. Hayes said quietly, erase it entirely through controlled trauma and conditioning. To him, the mind was clay, and children were merely the softest material. In the archives, Sarah unearthed personal letters exchanged between Dr. Moray Blackwood and his brother Cornelius. They revealed a chilling partnership, one cloaked in respectability and funded by greed. Cornelius had provided the money, the buildings, and the illusion of philanthropy. Moray provided the science. In a letter dated July 3, 1898, Moray wrote with a disturbing enthusiasm, "Dear brother, the current subjects are responding exceptionally well to the treatments. We have managed to erase all remnants of their previous selves. Their emotions, attachments, even their names gone. They are like blank slates, completely malleable to our designs." Sarah's hands trembled as she read Cornelius's reply. "Excellent progress, brother. Government investors are eager to see results. If we can prove that problematic children can be entirely reformed, we'll secure federal contracts for decades." The words made her stomach twist. The Blackwood brothers hadn't been seeking cures. They were developing methods of mind control to be sold to the government. The children weren't patients at all. They were test material. In a family trunk stored at the museum, Sarah discovered Moray's personal diary. Its pages were fragile, filled with the cold precision of a man who saw humanity as a science experiment. September 15th, 1898. Thomas no longer answers to his name. Elizabeth has lost all ability to cry or express emotion. Samuel follows commands without hesitation. Mary does not speak unless directly ordered. The experiment has achieved complete success. Sarah felt a wave of nausea. The photo, that single frozen moment from 1898, had captured the exact instant when these children ceased to be themselves. Their empty eyes weren't expression of stillness or discipline. They were the aftermath of months of calculated torment souls, emptied by design. On October 20th, 2024, unable to let go, Sarah returned to the image itself. Her thoughts kept circling back to that faint silhouette in the window, the shadow that seemed to be watching. Using specialized enhancement software, she began refining the image, pixel by pixel. What emerged was unmistakably human, yet wrong. The posture was stiff, hunched and menacing, someone watching from behind the glass. As Sarah adjusted the filters, her breath caught. The figure wore a white medical coat. In one hand, clearly visible, was a large syringe. The stance suggested something ritualistic, as if the photo session itself was a signal, and the figure was waiting for permission to act. Sarah sent the file to Marcus Weber, a world-renowned expert in forensic analysis of historical images. Marcus had worked on similar cases photos that revealed truths buried for a century. After running a series of spectral light tests, his voice came through the call, tight with disbelief. "Sarah, this is extraordinary," he said. "The person in the window is absolutely holding a medical instrument. But there's more." He highlighted faint shapes Sarah hadn't noticed before, 3 other human outlines hidden in the background. There were multiple adults present, Marcus explained, standing in doorways at windows, watching. This wasn't a family portrait. It was an orchestrated event, a documented procedure. Armed with this revelation, Sarah returned once more to the archives. They buried deep within the files, she found another entry in Morai Blackwood's diary, dated September 16, 1898. "Tomorrow, we proceed with the final phase. Government investors have arrived from Washington to witness the demonstration. The photograph will serve as proof of the subject's docility prior to the terminal procedure." Sarah's blood ran cold. That photograph, the one she had been studying for weeks, had not been taken for memory or for love. It was documentation proof for investors, a presentation of success before the children's final disposition. And then came the confirmation she dreaded. An invoice dated September 22, 1898, from a local funeral home. 4 child burials, Blackwood Institution emergency procedure. There it was, in cold ink, faded by time, but undeniable. The 4 children had been executed immediately after the photo session. Their final image wasn't just a record of what had been done to them. It was the moment before they ceased to exist. The photograph Sarah discovered was not merely a relic of a forgotten experiment. It was something far darker. The last image ever taken of 4 innocent children, moments before their lives were erased, all to conceal an unspeakable secret. It was October 22nd, 2024. For days, Sarah had immersed herself in old government archives, chasing a trail that seemed to grow colder and more horrifying with every new document. What she uncovered next would change everything she believed about that photograph and about the government that had quietly buried it. In the dusty records of the US Department of War dated 1898, Sarah found letters marked confidential for internal review. They spoke of secret research during the Spanish-American War, where the government had quietly funded experiments to develop new forms of psychological control. Traditional methods of interrogation, it seemed, were not enough. In one letter, dated August 5, 1898, Secretary of War Russell Alger wrote chillingly, "We must develop techniques that guarantee total compliance and the elimination of resistance." Sarah's heart sank. It wasn't just a rogue doctor, the government itself had paid for this. Dr. Morai Blackwood hadn't been acting in isolation. He had been hired as the principal consultant for what was called an ultra-black project. The children, those poor orphans, had been chosen not for treatment, but for testing. their only purpose to perfect methods of psychological conditioning that could later be used on prisoners of war, enemy agents, and political dissidents. In a classified report dated September 10, 1898, Dr. Blackwood wrote coldly, "Child subjects are ideal. Their psychological plasticity allows complete modification of personality in short periods. Techniques can later be adapted for adult use with minor adjustments." Sarah could barely breathe as she read those words. The children Thomas, Elizabeth, Samuel, and Mary had been selected precisely because no one would come looking for them. They were orphans, disposable, convenient. Their silence became the foundation for a weapon of the mind. Further investigation revealed that high-ranking Department of War officials had been present during that haunting photograph, the same one Sarah had uncovered. The photograph, it turned out, was never a family portrait. It was evidence official documentation of success, a demonstration to government investors that total psychological obedience could indeed be engineered. An internal memo dated September 20th, 1898 read, "Dr. Blackwood's demonstration was a success. Subjects displayed total compliance and complete elimination of resistance. Additional funding approved for program expansion." Sarah felt a chill crawl through her body. The 4 children in that photograph were not the end. They were the beginning, prototypes, the first in a long line of victims sacrificed in the name of control. By October 24th, 2024, Sarah had pieced together something far greater and far more horrifying than a single experiment. Through declassified government papers, she uncovered evidence of an entire network of facilities spread across the country in the 1890s. 12 institutions in total, all disguised as homes for disturbed or deficient children. But in truth, they were laboratories, each one quietly funded by the federal government. In a 1901 Inspector General's report, she found a single paragraph that made her hands tremble. It is conservatively estimated that approximately 300 child subjects participated in various psychological research projects between 1896 and 1900. Developed methods have been successfully implemented in military operations in the Philippines, Cuba, and other territories. Sarah stared at the paper for a long time. The ink had faded, but the horror felt alive, breathing between the lines. 300 children erased, their pain repurposed into instruments of obedience. The program had worked. And as she sat alone in the dim light of the archive room, Sarah whispered to herself, or maybe to the shadows that seemed to gather around her, how many photographs like this were taken, and how many are still hidden? The truth Sarah uncovered went far beyond the walls of one forgotten asylum. The experiments she had traced weren't theoretical, and they weren't confined to the past. They had been used, refined, perfected, and unleashed in real wars upon civilians who never stood a chance. Among the brittle pages of the archives, Sarah found photographs from other institutions across the country, each one bearing the same dreadful symmetry. Rows of children dressed in identical uniforms, faces blank, eyes hollow. Every image posed like a portrait. Yet all of them were clinical calculated records of human erasure. In the correspondence between Dr. Morai Blackwood and Dr. Henrik Zimmerman, director of a similar facility in Pennsylvania, Sarah read words that chilled her to her core. "Dear colleague, our refined methods have proven 100% effective. subjects can be completely reprogrammed and stripped of individual personality in 4 to 6 months. We recommend immediate nationwide expansion. That sentence lingered like a whisper in her mind, nationwide expansion. This had never been an isolated horror. It had been a program. Sarah then discovered something even worse. The Department of War had formally codified Blackwood's methods into an official manual, a thick volume titled Advanced Techniques of Psychological Modification for Military and Civil Application. It had been quietly distributed to intelligence officers and had formed the backbone of later research projects. Some of those projects Sarah found bore names. She recognized names like MK Ultra Bluebird Artichoke, programs the world believed began in the 1950s, but they hadn't begun there at all. Their true origins stretched back to Blackwood's experiments on children in 1898. Among Blackwood's own papers, one final note revealed his twisted pride. My pioneering work with child subjects has laid the scientific foundation for psychological warfare that will serve our nation for generations. For a long moment, Sarah just stared at those words. The room around her felt colder, quieter, as if the walls themselves recoiled. Thomas, Elizabeth, Samuel, and Mary. Those 4 faces in the photograph had not simply been victims of a single atrocity. They were the first in a lineage of suffering that would stretch across a century of hidden wars. It was October 26, 2024. Sarah now understood that the story she had uncovered wasn't just history. It was a crime still being concealed. The documents showed that the cover-up had begun almost immediately after the Salem institution's closure. A memo from March 15, 1902 ordered the immediate destruction of all records related to psychological research projects. All archives and photographs must be destroyed. Families of subjects are not to be contacted. Employees must sign permanent confidentiality agreements under penalty of treason. Sarah's hands trembled as she read further. Doctors, nurses, even clerks, all silenced. And those who might have spoken didn't live long enough to try. Dr. Moray Blackwood, the architect of the program, had died in a convenient automobile accident in 1903. His brother Cornelius was found lifeless in his study soon after no investigation ever filed. Through the decades, scattered attempts to reopen the case were always extinguished. FBI files from the 1920s, 1940s, and 1960s described intermittent discoveries of sensitive materials. Each time, the same outcome. Evidence recovered could gravely compromise national security. Recommend permanent classification and destruction. Sarah sat in silence. That photograph, the one she'd found tucked away in a family donation box, had survived only by accident. It had escaped a century-long purge by hiding in plain sight, quietly waiting for someone to see it. And then, there was the final revelation. In the 1970s, during public outrage over CIA mind control programs, the government quietly reclassified the original 1898 documents as top secret. A 1978 Department of Justice memo admitted in chillingly measured language, while irregularities are acknowledged in the Psychological Research Program of 1896-1900, disclosure could compromise ongoing intelligence operations and create significant legal exposure. Continued secrecy is advised. Sarah leaned back from the papers, her breath unsteady. What she had uncovered was not a forgotten crime. It was a living one, buried beneath the weight of national security. A secret maintained protected, and perpetuated for more than 120 years. The 4 children in that photograph had not only been victims of cruel experiments, they had been buried beneath decades of silence. Their empty smiles frozen in that faded frame from 1898 had become the only surviving witness to one of the darkest, longest hidden secrets in American history. It was October 28th, 2024. Sarah Mitchell sat alone in her dimly lit office at the Salem Local History Museum, staring at the image that had changed her life. She had made her decision, the hardest of her career. She would make the story public. No more archives, no more sealed files. The world deserved to know what had happened to Thomas, Elizabeth, Samuel, and Mary. Sarah reached out to David Harrison, an investigative journalist at the Boston Globe, known for uncovering government secrets. When he saw the documents, he went pale. "Sarah," he whispered, "this is bigger than you can imagine. We're not just talking about experiments, we're talking about the origins of decades of mind control programs. Buried under national security. For days they worked without rest, verifying every record, every photograph, every line of testimony. The evidence was absolute. Even family archives from descendants of former employees confirmed what the official files had tried to hide. Then, on October 31st, 2024, the Boston Globe published the story on its front page. The Lost Children of Salem Government. Mind control experiments revealed by 1898 photograph. The image of the 4 children, those lifeless eyes staring through, time filled the world's screens. The reaction was instant. The Department of Justice issued denials, but the document spoke louder than politics ever could. Members of Congress demanded investigations. Threats came, of course, anonymous calls. Strange cars outside Sarah's apartment. But so did the letters. Hundreds of them from activists, from historians, and from people who believed their own relatives might have suffered in similar programs. And then came one letter that changed everything. It was from Margaret Whitmore, a 45-year-old woman from Maine. She was Thomas's great-granddaughter. When Sarah met her, Margaret could barely speak. "Dr. Mitchell," she said softly. "My family always knew something terrible had happened to Thomas. But seeing his face, those empty eyes..." She paused, trembling. "It's heartbreaking, but it's also a relief. We finally know the truth." It was November 15th, 2024. The air in Salem's Green Lawn Cemetery was cold, quiet, and still. Sarah stood before a new memorial, the granite smooth and pale in the morning light. On it were carved 4 names that history had tried to erase: Thomas Whitmore, Elizabeth Hayes, Samuel Porter, Mary Campbell. Innocent victims of government experiments, 1898. Sarah gently placed the original photograph at the base of the monument. For the first time, she thought the children looked peaceful. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered through tears. "The whole world knows your story now." Margaret stood beside her, joined by the descendants of the other children who had been identified through the global investigation that followed. These children were stolen from their families, Margaret said, her voice steady. They were stripped of their humanity and then murdered. But their photograph waited patiently for 126 years to speak. That's a kind of justice too. In the weeks that followed, the US Congress passed a formal resolution of apology to the victims of the 1898 or 1900 mind control experiments. A reparations fund was established for descendants, and the Salem Local History Museum opened a permanent exhibition, The Lost Children, Psychological Experiments and the Fight for Truth. At the center of the exhibit hung the photograph, now protected behind glass, surrounded by declassified documents and letters from the families. Visitors described feeling something strange when they stood before it, as though the children's eyes, once vacant, were watching back, finally at peace. Sarah received messages from researchers across the world. More institutions were identified in Europe and Asia, each tied to the same secret network of psychological research that had begun in Salem. It seemed the photograph had unlocked a doorway that could never again be closed. The story changed everything. Universities began teaching the Blackwood experiments in ethics courses. Human rights groups used the story to demand transparency in government research. And across the world, people began to look again at old photographs, wondering what other truths had been quietly waiting inside them. As Sarah walked away from the cemetery that evening, the November wind carrying the scent of rain, she thought about what one single image had done. A picture taken in 1898, meant to document obedience, had instead defied time itself. It had spoken. It had survived. It had remembered what the world wanted to forget. The 4 children of Salem had found their voice at last. Their faces, preserved by accident, had transcended death and silence. And in doing so, they had become a warning, a whisper carried across a century, reminding us what happens when power hides behind science and when truth is buried in the name of progress. Their eyes had waited 126 years to be seen again. And now that they had been, they would never close. What do you think? If a seemingly harmless photo could change history, how many other forgotten children are there still waiting for someone like Sarah to open the files that sleep in the dark? Stay with Sleepy History Tales, because sometimes the oldest secrets are the ones that are still alive.